what are the key historical and geopolitical factors that set the stage for the conflict in Ukraine, in your view?
I think generally speaking, there are two. There's the imperial story and there's the security or geopolitical story. The imperial story is the multi-century desire on the part of Russian elites to dominate Ukraine. A recent book on this was just published by Yevgeny Finkel of George Washington University about Russia's 200-year quest to essentially eliminate Ukraine and dominate it. And this is an excellent account of the imperial dimension. Other recent studies, including by Serhiy Plokhy of the Harvard University, cover this very, very well. On the international relations side, there's a good deal of evidence that the security element at least played some role. Russia and elites thinking that they deserve a bigger role in Europe, to include a so-called sphere of influence in what they call the near abroad. And there's some evidence that they believe the U.S. Power in the world is slipping, and that it was time back in February 2022 to deliver a blow to the American led world order, so to speak, and that the way to do this was to hit at their old imperial object of desire, namely Ukraine, using the argument that Ukraine's potential entry into NATO would somehow be a threat to Russian security. This is something that is widely believed among Russian elites, whether we think they should believe it or not. They seem to believe it. So those two elements, imperial domination plus these security arguments that Russian elites continually make, came together in 2022, plus the assessment of the balance of power, that this was time to move, all kind of came together in 2022 to give rise to this disastrous decision on the part of Vladimir Putin to invade his neighbor.
For sure. And the Russians originally thought they could take over Ukraine in 3 days. That was their plan. But now the war continues for several years now. And in your view, why do you think Russia continues this war, even though it faces harsh sanctions and it's really hurting its own economy?
It's important. Let me just emphasize what you said at the end of your question. Russia's economy is being hurt, even if its capacity to wage war has not been eliminated. The long-term effects of this war on Russia's economy are really devastating. Russia's claim to great power status is, in some sense, being undermined by its own misbegotten war in Ukraine. But as to the sort of miscalculations, the Russian authorities, particularly their intelligence organizations, believe they had Ukraine penetrated. They believe they had fifth columns inside Ukraine. They believe they had agents in Ukraine who would do their bidding. They thought that a big invasion would create a context in which you'd see local pro-Russian elements rise up. Some of these had been planted in advance. We have some of the documents have been captured by the Ukrainian intelligence services and shared. So they had this vision of a Ukraine that was a house of cards that would fall quickly, and of course, they were wrong. I have to say, Alexander, though, that their decision to keep fighting is not unusual for great powers. When they go to war and it doesn't turn out like they expect, they tend to keep fighting. So this is not a purely Russian-Ukrainian war thing. This is you could see the United States in Vietnam. You could see the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. You can pick any number of cases where they go in thinking it's going to be easy. The local target fights back much harder than they expected. And instead of realizing that their whole theory of the war was wrong, they just double down, as we say, kept putting more resources into it and keep fighting. And now what you see in the Russian conversation is they are defining this war as a sort of global struggle for what they call multipolarity, that they're going to somehow, if they come out of this war well, they will somehow transform the international system to something more compatible for Russia. So they raise the stakes. And as you know, I know you know very well, they have claimed basically 5 regions of Ukraine, Crimea plus 4 oblasts that they say are Russian, and they print maps showing that this is Russia. So they sort of planted this flag in the ground, and they're going to keep fighting unless compelled to stop.
And what do you think of Trump's this statement of ending the war in 24 hours, which we saw didn't happen? But do you see him ending the war faster than the previous administration?
He is a very difficult figure to read. The tea leaves, that is just the evidence leaking out of Washington, and also, by the way, out of Kiev. I mean, when we hear Zelensky talking, when we hear, it's not just Trump. Lots of people seem to be talking about some kind of push towards some kind of ceasefire in a time frame looking measured in months, like maybe as quickly as 6 months. I have no idea how serious this is. We do know that Donald Trump's special envoy for Ukraine, the General Keith Kellogg, threw out some ideas about the nature of a settlement, which Russian spokesman, I think Lavrov, shot down immediately as completely not representing. So, you know, the we just don't know. I think there will be a push. I think it's likely that there will be a push towards some sort of negotiations within the 6 month time frame. I think Donald Trump is probably not going to cut loose Ukraine and cut off funding to Ukraine. I certainly hope not. I don't think so within that time frame. But we don't know what will happen when Russia reveals what it is really after in Ukraine. When Russia fails to, if Russia fails to be a accommodating negotiator, accepting reasonable proposals, if instead Russia is insisting on maximalist war aims, then I really don't know what the Trump people will do when they discover this. That's a question I just can't answer. But again, very quickly to return to where you started, the 24-hour thing and the comments we heard from Trump and from his vice president JD Vance about I don't care about Ukraine. Interestingly, we have not heard as much about that since inauguration. So I see that as a slightly good sign that the Trump people are not going to sell Ukraine's future too cheaply.
Yeah, and in your view, like how effective was like NATO and EU response to Russia's actions, and what different could they do differently moving forward?
Well, I think that the best thing they could do, there's a huge amount of debate on this. I've written about it in the magazine Foreign Affairs. There's just a ton of swirling issues in this debate. NATO membership, the question of what sort of weaponry is given to Ukraine. Did the United States and its allies go too slowly? All of those are important, and we can have those debates. But the number one thing that the West can do to help Ukraine end this war on acceptable terms is to commit to the long-term assistance of Ukraine, to make it written in stone that as long as this war continues, as long as Russia continues to be occupying Ukraine territory and fighting, that we will continue to aid Ukraine. So Putin gets the message that the West's support is solid. It's only then that he would be willing to negotiate in any kind of serious way. The way things are now, he keeps thinking anytime the West is going to stop aiding Ukraine, in which case he can continue advancing and plundering. So that's the number one thing that I wish the U.S. and its allies could do, which is make a legislative, transparent commitment to a continued flow of military and civilian aid to Ukraine.
And how would you assess the United States leadership and policy in this conflict?
I'm less critical of the Biden administration's policy on Ukraine than many supporters of Ukraine are. I think the Biden administration did a fairly good job of navigating the situation. I know many people wanted them to do more and are highly critical. I personally think it was a very tough situation for them to adjust to. I think they did a brilliant job in the lead up to the war regarding the intelligence, regarding the warning, regarding attempting to convince Putin that this was a bad idea. And then once the war started, there was a careful policy of opening up the avenues of aid to organizing a global coalition, including countries way outside of Europe, to help aid the country and imposing, again, a very strong set of sanctions. And in the last days of the Biden administration, they actually hit Russia with some additional sanctions that are actually pretty substantial. And in the view of at least some economists, although it's not going to bring the war to an end immediately, those sanctions that were announced will impose considerably heavier costs on the Russian economy. So overall, I evaluate the Biden administration. What, a B plus, an A minus. Could have they done better? Sure, but in the annals of statecraft, not bad.
Yeah, for sure. And how is this conflict in Ukraine reshaping global politics and global alliances, like especially in Europe, China, and the global South?
Yeah, it's not it's terrible. I mean, basically, you know what's happening. It has to some degree solidified the Western alliance. It has generated a more seriousness on the part of Europeans on building up their defense capacity. You saw a bigger change on this. First was 2014 invasion of Ukraine, the shooting down the Malaysian air flight, and then you saw a big uptick. And then February 2022, you saw a much bigger uptick increase in European autonomous defense efforts. So that's been one effect. However, it has also solidified the Russo-Chinese bloc. Xi Jinping was very mad at Putin when Putin was doing nuclear threats, but has stuck by Putin through all of this. And in fact, their coalition is becoming more tighter. We see BRICS expanding to some degree. We see global South sympathies really not as much on the side of the West slash Ukraine coalition as one would have hoped. You see the world. I wouldn't call it a new Cold War. A lot of people like to call it that. I have my academic reasons for saying that's a little bit misleading. However, you've seen really deleterious effects lining up of people on different states and on different sides in wide swaths of the world as a result of this war. However, I would say this: it's not over. And there's going to be, when it does end, there will be a huge effort on the part of Russia to define it as a huge victory, and there will be a huge effort on the part of the West to say it was a huge defeat for Russia. I personally believe, under almost any circumstances we can imagine, it will be a major defeat for Russia. I can not imagine that Ukraine is going to survive as an independent democratic state aligned with the West. And that outcome is not what Putin wanted when he invaded. He's not going to get what he wanted. And people are going to try to redefine it as, oh, yeah, this is a huge victory for Russia. I don't think it's a huge victory for Russia. I don't think we should fall for that narrative. I think it's a very dangerous narrative to fall for.
Yeah, absolutely. And what, in your view, like, what are the most viable pathways for diplomatic resolution, and which actors should be like taken care of in mediating a settlement?
I think the standard view is there will be that Kiev and Moscow are going to be the key players with the United States a key player. Russia wants to negotiate with the United States. I mean, you know the story. They don't. They think that the only real person to talk to is the U.S. They don't believe that the government in Kiev is where to go. But that we cannot allow that. However, there will likely be non-official back channel conversations between Moscow and Washington prior to the beginning of the negotiations. That's normal. But when it comes to formal negotiations, the key parties have to be some European representation, the U.S., Russia, and obviously Ukraine. And how that all is pieced together is this is what we paid diplomats to do. But the U.S. is going to play a role in this, even though the U.S. claims and that it would not want to accept an agreement that is not also acceptable to the Ukrainian authorities.
And what lasting changes do you anticipate in global governance, international law, and security frameworks after this conflict?
I think the norm on the sanctity of sovereign borders will have taken a blow because, sadly and tragically, barring a huge turnaround and a big shift in the correlation forces that most analysts don't see, Putin's going to end up sitting on some Ukrainian sovereign territory when this thing is over. How long I mean, it won't be recognized. The United States and the Europeans aren't going to, but the Russians are going to want to ask for formal recognition of this territorial boundary change. We're not going to want to give it unless the Ukrainians say that they're willing to accept it, which I can never imagine that happening. So but even so, he's probably going to end up sitting on Ukrainian territory, which means the strong post World War II norm about the sanctity of borders and the inadmissibility of the use of force to change those borders will have taken a blow. But it will not be a utter destruction of this norm or a complete transformation of the international system into a 19th century style imperialist land grab world, because it's simply what the Ukrainians have shown, with some help from the outside, is how unbelievably costly it is to steal territory from a unified nation. They will fight and they will impose enormous costs on you. What Russia is paid in blood and treasure for this 20% of Ukraine that it now occupies, very few countries would be willing to accept those costs. So I don't think you're seeing a total upending of the global equilibrium, but it has definitely taken a blow.
Yeah, and beyond Ukraine, what other global regions or disputes do you see as potential flashpoints in the coming years?
The big one that everybody has, at least for Americans, the world's a big place. So if you live in Africa, if you live in Southern Africa or the north of Africa or Northeast Africa, or if you live in different parts of South Asia, you may have a different perspective. But from an American perspective, the big fear and concern is Taiwan and the circumstances in which China might decide that it's going to resolve the Taiwan question with military force, either coercive force or an outright invasion of the island. Many people in the U.S. government, at least, consider this to be a very serious medium term, by which I mean couple-year kind of threat. Others discount this and say no such decision has been taken in Beijing, and that actually there's plenty of avenues to avoid this conflict. But this is the conflict that the world is worried about and sees as plausible, and should it occur, would be exceedingly costly and deliver a massive blow to the global economy, global stability, and first and foremost to the people living in the region.
Yeah, and what is the role of scholars and academic institutions in shaping public understanding and policy debates on conflicts like this?
I think scholars need to, I think there's a very important role in the world for analysis, policy evaluation that is not partisan, that is not connected to a government or a think tank that is receiving funds from governments. I think that having a university that is independent with scholars who have tenure and cannot be fired because of their views, with scholars who have the time to put deep research into questions, is an invaluable input into these kinds of debates. And so I think, whereas I know that, think tanks and policy research institutes that are not universities, have a very important role to play. So there's, of course, journalism, very important role to play, but there is a crucial contribution made by academics who study policy relevant questions in the academy. And I do find in my own experience that people who make policy occasionally do reach out beyond the walls of government to look for that kind of independent analysis. And so at the margins, it may have a positive influence on policymaking.
And looking ahead, do you anticipate, are you like optimistic or pessimistic about the direction of global politics, and what factors will be the most influential in shaping the future?
I'm pessimistic in comparison to where we are coming from. We are coming from a period, and I know for the younger people who might listen to this podcast, that might sound unpersuasive, but I'm willing to make the argument. The period we are coming from, which is the post-Cold War period of international politics, the so-called unipolar era of American preeminence in the world, was a remarkably peaceful and prosperous time in international politics. Very few interstate wars. The prevalence of civil wars went down dramatically during this period, roughly from about 1993, 94 till about 2012, 14. We're coming out of that period with an increase in great power competition, and it's not looking good. We're seeing a decoupling of the global economy. We are seeing an erection of trade wars. that will have very bad consequences for overall global welfare. We're seeing a decline in cooperation, and of course, we're seeing an increase in security competition, increase in the problem of civil war, and an increase in the existence and danger of further interstate war. All bad. However, I do not believe, and this is a subject for academic research and debate, but I do not think there's a good argument to suggest we're going to go back as bad as things were in the Cold War. People forget how bloody and costly that 45-year struggle between the United States and the USSR was. And I think there are good reasons to think it won't get that bad in terms of the toll enacted upon humanity. So that's kind of where I see we are, where I see where things are going.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we're coming to an end here, what's your message to Ukrainians and to students interested in studying international relations?
I'm sorry, because you said, is it for you, for any student?
Yeah, for just like any student studying international relations, and yeah.
Well, the importance of these issues is that these issues, studying international relations, has always been important. There's never been a period where, oh, it doesn't matter what happens internationally. And so you have to bear that in mind. However, given what we've been talking about on this in this conversation, I think it's fair to say that the stakes are higher now than they have been in the past for the future of your prosperity, the future of your security, the future, the future quality of life of young people who've got a whole career ahead of them. And understanding these international elements, I think, is more important than it's ever been, or at least as important as it's ever been. Many careers take an international pathway. And those international pathways are now more complicated than they were 10 years ago in terms of where you can go, what the opportunities are, and what the challenges and risks are. So I think this kind of this kind of study is of great usefulness for a large number of people, even if they don't major in the topic or focus in it. Taking some courses, getting smart about international politics is a good move.
And following up on the first part of the question, what's your message to Ukrainians?
Well, to Ukrainians, I mean, what it seems presumptuous to me to give Ukrainians a message. I mean, one is a sort of astonishment and appreciation and respect for what the nation has done under these unbelievably trying circumstances. I do think that a message could be one of that things are looking, I think President Zelensky has said similar things. Things are looking slightly better for Ukraine's prospects in terms of support from the United States than we thought they were a couple of months ago. And so I would cling to that thought. As we face these very tough circumstances.